Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for tuning in today. My name is Christian Hähnel. I'm president of American Friends of the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation. And I welcome you together with my friend and colleague, Steve Sokol, president and CEO of American Council on Germany. Steve and I are happy to co-host today's event. A very warm welcome, of course, goes to Bernhard Sabel and to Elisabeth Malsch, who have agreed to be on our panel today. For over 70 years, American Council on Germany, ACG, has been strengthening transatlantic relations. It was founded in 1952, and almost at the very same time, only 1 year later, in 1953, the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation was established in Germany. Both ACG and American Friends of Humboldt follow the conviction that transatlantic understanding and cooperation is crucial for tackling the challenges and issues together that our societies are facing today. Challenges such as climate change, sustainability, artificial intelligence, societal polarization, international security, to name just a few. We need to pool resources, exchange best practices, and learn from each other in order to solve problems that are relevant for all of us on both sides of the Atlantic. ACG and American Friends of Humboldt serve as advocates for the transatlantic cause, and we're happy to share resources and networks today for our event. The topic of our event today is the prevalence of fake scientific papers and the danger of misinformation in the sciences. A first glance at Bernhard Sabel's findings, and the prevalence seems to be shockingly high. Also, the dangers seem to be manifold. Lack of scientific knowledge or a misrepresentation of facts can have catastrophic consequences, not only in academia, but also in the real world. Infrastructure is one very important example where misinformation leads to very concrete safety hazards. As an expert, Elisabeth Malsch might elaborate on this a bit later. Fake science, fake news, fake something. The label fake has become a politically very charged term in recent years. A basic but also key question in this context is, what are the criteria for labeling scientific or journalistic findings as fake? And who applies the fake label with what motives? What are the reasons? Traditionally, the simple appreciation of indisputable facts would have qualified to separate the real from the fake. This, I think, changed when the idea of alternative facts entered the mainstream of political and societal discourse. Believing in alternative facts leads to polarization, because for a necessary minimum of social cohesion, we need a certain set of facts and convictions that everyone can buy into, regardless of personal, political, economic, or geographic identity. We at ACG and American Friends of Humboldt try to counter the trend of alternative facts and misinformation. We try to rebuild trust in the values of science so that our democratic societies based on the rule of law and an appreciation of facts can stay resilient in face of the great challenges we face internally and externally. If you share our vision and if you like today's event, stay in touch with us, please. Both ACG and American Friends are always on the lookout for partners and supporters. Reach out to us. Let us co-create transatlantic impact. Once again, thank you very much, everybody, for being with us today. I wish all of us an engaging event. And with that, I'm handing over to you now, my friend, Steve.
Herzlichen Dank, Christian. Thank you so much for setting the stage for us. I can only underscore how happy I am and we are to be partnering with you and your colleagues at the American Friends of the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation for this event, and I hope it's the first of many. Listening to Christian talk just now about the kinds of tips that we love to get from our viewers, we're also always looking for interesting topics and interesting themes. And sometimes we stumble across them, as was the case today. A few weeks ago, I was listening to the radio and I heard an interview with Professor Dr. Bernhard Sabel from the Otto von Guericke University in Magdeburg and thought, wow, this sounds like a really interesting story. Of course, he was talking about the paper that he had just released on fake scientific studies. And I did a little bit of research and found a little more information about him and about his work, and reached out to Christian to say, is this something that the foundation would be interested in doing together? And he said, yes, absolutely. And we have among our alumni, Dr. Elisabeth Malsch, who is the leader in the forensic practice at the firm of Thornton Tomasetti here in New York. And we thought this is a great pairing to talk about some of these fake scientific papers, but also their broader implications. And so with that, I'd like to just say herzlich willkommen to Professor Dr. Bernhard Sabel, and a warm welcome to you, Elisabeth Malsch. Delighted to have both of you with us today. And we'll dive right into our conversation. And so I thought we could maybe start, Bernhard, by having you share with us a little bit about the paper that you recently published. Sort of what's the lay of the land, what's going on, and most importantly, what's the scope of the problem that we're trying to talk about today?
Okay, thanks a lot, Stephen and Christian, for having me present these results. I think fostering American-German friendship is an important source for a discussion and activities. And I'm very happy, also having lived in the US for many years and studied there, to share that and discuss it with you. So I just give you a brief view of some of the basic features of our findings. Before doing so, I just want to illustrate why I became interested in this topic. Of course, as a researcher, you always want to know what's true and what's not true. But I'm also editor of a journal called Restorative Neurology and Neuroscience, where I kind of stumbled across this topic by chance, I should say, by a small little laboratory journal that almost no scientist reads. It's mostly a technician's journal, but also feel responsible for the science as a system. And in my function as the state chapter chairperson of the German Association of German Universities. So that being said, let me just give you a brief rundown. Some of these I showed already at the publishers meeting, the Academic Publishing in Europe 2022. Paper mills are agencies that advertise on the internet fake services. And by fake services, I mean generating papers with strong support by AI, using fake data, using fake images, using fake text, copying text, using fake authors, using fake review processes, and so on. So whatever sin you can think of, it is part of the story. Such paper mills produce these automatically, and they do it for profit. And one could argue, if or if not, they're an illegal organization. Maybe Elisabeth can sort of pick up on that point. They produce and sell and fabricated or manipulated manuscripts, and do this automatically, and also by support of scientists who may or may not know that they're helping to edit a paper. I'm sure that not everyone that helps to edit, who lives in the US or in the UK, maybe a poor scientist who needs a little extra income, says, I do a good deed by helping them. In reality, they're supporting the fake. They may not even know it. Some may know and others may not. But why is it such an attractive process of fake publishing? It's because students and also scientists are under extreme pressure in some countries more than in others to publish scientific papers to advance in their careers, either to get a job or to become chairperson or to get a salary raise. I just recently spoke to an Iranian scientist. She reported that one of her previous colleagues became boss after publishing several fake papers, and that advanced him to become a director of a neuroscience institute. Just to sort of illustrate a sample, a case here. What motivates them? Well, the unrealistic pressure from institutions, perhaps even the governments, we don't know, but certainly from institutions or from colleagues who make the decisions for career advancement, induces quite a lot of anxiety not to make it. And so, especially since in the field that we studied, biomedicine, doctors and hospitals are under extreme pressure already by their patients. And unless they sacrifice all of their private life, they won't even have the time and sometimes not the resources to do serious research that that is worth publishing. But yet they have the pressure to advance. And so the best way to get out of that is to pay some money to a paper mill in order to receive promotion, or for students to graduate, or to increase scientists to increase their salaries. So the first thing when I heard about it is I checked the literature, what is known about fake publications, and these are true fakes. And we need to clearly differentiate true fake from red flagging, that meaning identifying papers that are suspicious. So what is the number of true fakes? So we searched the literature and then added up the number of fake papers that were proven to be fake, which over, like a whole range of years, you see it starts in even 1946, but most of them in the 2000s, that we have about 14,000 fake publications not known at that time, we started working on this in 2021. So you would say, well, 14,000 out of, let's say, 1.3 million biomedical publications, it's okay, it's not good, but it's a relatively small number, yeah, that can happen, and people do make mistakes and people do fake, but it's kind of a small problem. But in my journal, I got more and more sort of papers where I thought this looks really fishy, and it's kind of a strange paper, and I hadn't really thought of papers being faked until I ran across this one source that talked about the paper mills. So how do paper mills work? Well, they advertise quite openly, specifically in Chinese websites, but also internationally. And they don't say, we write fake papers for you. They sell themselves as either ghostwriting agencies outright, or they call themselves editing services, with all support that you need, sort of. And you get a good deal, and it helps you publish your paper. When you get in contact with them, we tried several times, they want to get on the phone with you. They don't want to interchange it by writing emails back and forth. Although I was lucky enough to speak to one paper mill, and that is a future paper going to be, that gave me a lot of information of how they work inside, and they even sent me 100 papers that they have published. So we are currently analyzing those. So that will be a fun story. Part of that is in my paper, the description of that paper mill. And it was quite shocking to see, how they develop their fraudulent services. So they advertise with slogans like, nowadays competition is getting stronger and more graduate students need to publish, blah, blah, blah. But many of the students, they can take advantage of ghostwriting, which is a great advantage. And as some put it, why make the effort of doing the research if you can just buy or order the paper? It is much less work, and you are much more successful with much less effort. So they openly advertise, and of course we can't read Chinese, so I have to call my friends in China and help me with some of these things, which some of them did, but they don't reveal their names for obvious reasons. So we red flag papers by identifying several parameters. 2 of them are private email use for the corresponding author. Then a bonus would be to have an international partner that collaborates with you on the paper. But we also looked at other factors as well, such as hospital affiliation. We even studied how many publications come out of that institution. And so on. So a number of different factors were looked at. And when we use what I would call a very liberal factor, one that tends to overestimate rather than underestimate the scope, we use that to see what is the percentage distribution among countries. And if we assume that the total scope of fake publishing in biomedicine is in the order of 100,000 and higher, it could be 200,000 or even more. I don't want to really fix a certain number to it because these are all red flags and some uncertainty involved. But you see that there are certain countries that publish relatively many papers from their country, like Russia, Turkey, China, and Egypt, and India. And then there is a sort of a clear jump on the right hand. You see that to other countries who publish less. And then there is what I call the error margin, or sort of the uncertainty margin for Europe, the US, and other countries. Interestingly, Russia is on the top of the list and the Ukraine on the bottom of the list. That may be chance, but I thought that was quite curious because they have a similar culture, but yet their practice is vastly different. So we think that there are three types of pressures. One could come from institutions or maybe even policy of these countries, that you need to publish more. Actually, this has been described for China and Russia in some references I found. But I also know from other countries and from students or scientists from those countries, they also have these official pressures. You have to publish blah, 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 number of papers. Then I think that the second step, the sort of intermediate a list of countries, they may be career driven, that the scientists themselves or individual departments or so are under pressure to publish more. And they may not have that much money to pay the paper mills either. Who knows? And then the error margin. Now, let's talk about the business, because I think if we follow the money, we understand what's going on more easily. So paper mills offer different kinds of services, and I don't want to get lost in the details here because of lack of time, but it ranges anywhere from helping to edit a paper, edit quote unquote, and make it look more slick, to creating false data, or also selling authorships. So I heard recently in China, there is a website where you can find titles of papers that are going to be published. They are sort of in the pipeline already. And you can add your authorship name to it by paying a certain amount of money. It's like you're going to go shopping for T-shirts, and you can just pick the T-shirt you like and then take, this fits me. The same way you can select the title that fits your qualification or your ambitions. I would consider fake papers any paper that has materials that that cast doubt on the study. I'm not talking about simple calculation mistakes or certain unintentional misrepresentations. So I'm talking about direct copies of images, the creation of fake data, the creation of fake sequences, which is a big field to study. A colleague in Australia, Jenny Byrne, works on that. Fake authors, paid authorships, copied papers, re-engineered by ChatGPT or AI in general, and so on. So whenever there is a fake element, I would call that fake. What we have done is we have red flag papers. So we have not made the effort to prove that a given paper is fake. That is a lot of work, and it has to be good enough to stand in front of a court hearing. That wasn't our goal. Our goal was to analyze 15,000 papers to get indications of how big the problem may be, or how big it is. So if you ask yourself, well, if I'm an author and I want to buy a paper, how much does it cost? So if you have the simple version of just submission, you send a manuscript, let's say one that needs a little, language fixing or something, that is relatively cheap if the journal that you send it to has a low impact factor. But if you have a higher a task, such as writing the paper, submission, and publication, including publication costs, let's say, you can easily end up with 8,000. Or if you are ambitious and you want to go for a higher impact factor journal, that includes the design. So you tell them what you design you would like to have, and then they say, okay, I understand, and we'll write the paper for you with fake experiments. If you are aiming for a journal 2.5 impact factor, it can, or higher, it can easily be 26,000 euros. You may ask yourself, well, who is willing or able to pay that? Well, if you look at those papers, many of them have a lot of authors, and they just split it. So if you have 10 authors, it's pretty cheap that you're an author for 2,500 euros a person. I think that also institutions may actually pay for the fee, for publication fees. And I don't have evidence for it, but I could easily imagine that this happens. Although I don't know for sure. It's just a rough guess. So if we now extrapolate such costs and ask ourselves, what's the revenue Let's make some assumptions that the biomedical field, which is known to have, at least in 2020, I think it is, or 21, 1.3 million publications per year globally, and you multiply it by a factor of, let's say, 15% fake, then the yearly number of fake publications are estimated at roughly 200,000 per year. I'm not talking about 14,000 over several years. I'm talking about 200,000. Or we can even be conservative and say, okay, maybe even half of that. But even if it's half of that, 100,000 fake papers a year is a matter of main concern. And if you look at all of sciences, including medicine, it adds up to 400,000 fake publications, and at an average assumed cost of 10,000 euros, probably can't get it much cheaper than that. I think nowadays, actually, the price is rising. The business revenue globally is in the order of several billion euros annually. And that drives the machine. This is the fuel that drives the machine. Who profits from it? Well, the authors, who are the customers, they profit from it. The paper mills profit from it. And the academic publishers, knowing or unknowingly, let's assume unknowingly for the moment, also profit from having more and more papers. And if you look at any field in PubMed, for example, which is the website where you find medical publications, it's incredible. If you look at the last years before, the growth was kind of like this, and all of a sudden it's going up asymptotically. And science doesn't grow that fast. And that also is of concern. So as a scientist, if you then look at a given paper and you have to decide whether you take this drug or recommend it to your patients, or whether you use this fertilizer to fertilize your grounds so that the plants grow, or that you use this vaccine or that or the other thing, or you make a decision on health policy and you end up with fake science, then you have a real problem. And there are actually known cases of death that result from fake clinical trials in the field of gynecology. There are several papers that prove that the recommendation of the wrong drug for pregnant women who are about to give birth by cesarean section, that the death rate increased by a drug that was supposed to control the, I think it was the blood pressure more effectively, some progesterone derivative. And they found more deaths. And in hindsight, it was discovered that all the studies, I think 25 studies or so, don't nail me on the exact number, but like a number of original studies that supported this approach, they were all fake. And a peer-reviewed review article that also supported it was also based on this fake, which then led to the wrong medical decisions. So I want to sum up by thinking about the implications of this whole thing. I think that we have the biggest science scam of all times right in front of our nose, and many people don't even know it. When I spoke to the president of an international medical society, and its society has 50,000 members, and I told him about this last year by Zoom, I explained it to him. He keeps staring at my screen, and I thought he's falling asleep or is wandering off with his mind. So I said, "Why are you staring?" And he says, "Wow, I had no idea." So you have an organization of 50,000 scientists where the president has no idea. It's like all the oceans are polluted and nobody has any idea. Just a few people, and they are not listened to. Okay, so it's a profitable business that runs this show to help scientists advance their careers. Money is earned by paper mills and by science publishers, especially the open access publishers. I think that they are more vulnerable there. Fake publications create massive knowledge pollution of the global permanent scientific record, which is the basis of our society. It influences health, economy, environment, technology. Maybe I forgot something, aerospace, material sciences, what have you. And it eats up a lot of resources, both human and financial resources. I also think it's a security risk, because a country that doesn't know what is fake is in a poor shape, whereas that country that knows which is fake is in a better shape to make the right decisions, because many decisions are based on numbers and assuming for now that the numbers are interpreted correctly, parentheses, they're not always interpreted correctly, we have an issue here. It also harms the honest authors and their institutions. I know from several Chinese colleagues who are quite worried to talk about it, and they don't like it, but they don't want to raise their voice because you don't know what will happen thereafter. But it has the risk of ruining the reputation of academic publishers and also certain countries. So everyone is well advised not to do nothing, but to do something, and to do something effective to prevent the damage of the trust of science as a whole. Because if you have 10 or whatever percentage or 20% of fake, then the common people, the non-scientists in the world, which is the large majority, may lose the trust in science in general, and then not or less so base decisions on scientific knowledge, because they say, hey, look, somebody lied and they lie, and now there is even a production machine that lies and pollutes the scientific record. How can we trust science at all? So there is a risk for science itself. And with the evolution of ChatGPT in its various versions now, which writes really very well, but just basically repeats what it finds in the internet. I put it very simple now, of course, forgive me. It is very easy to write, more easy to write papers because the text is even better. And at one of the conferences in January that I was able to attend this year, also by the academic publishers in Europe, where Springer Nature and Elsevier and the two big elephants and many other companies were represented, they were all excited about a lecture where an entrepreneur made the suggestion that scientific publications could be automatically translated to news for the general media by ChatGPT. Now, no journalists needed anymore. Mm-hmm. So no discussion needed, just write it. That is really worrying, because now the fake of the science finds its way to the fake in the public media. And in the end, we can't trust anything anymore because we don't know, is it fake or is it not? And therefore, I think we have a major global crisis here at hand that we need to study much more vigorously and pay attention to it, and also find ways to deal with it and get rid of it. How that can be done is a separate task and a separate discussion or lecture. But I think we need to do something, and it needs to be a concerted effort. Some governments are aware of it. I know at least one government where I know they're aware of it, and that is the US, because a representative from the House of Representatives had a hearing about last year around this time to learn about fake publishing. And he himself cited a paper that he submitted, a paper by Fermi, which was published in 1934 or something like this, that laid the basis for the development of the nuclear bomb. He used this paper, rewrote it with ChatGPT, and then sent it to a journal editor, and he got to a top journal, and the journal said, this is a great paper, we'll accept this right away. After he basically modified it. So okay, so with that, I want to end my short lecture so we have time for discussion and also comments from Elisabeth on it. Thank you very much for attending the meeting, and I have the pleasure to take any questions.
Well, Bernhard, many thanks. Thank you for sharing this with us, both in terms of the scope, but also in terms of the risks that exist. And I think that we'll definitely get into a conversation about some of those risks a little bit more. I do have a couple of follow-up questions that have come from some of our viewers that I'd like to just fold in quickly, and then bring Elisabeth in. One of, obviously some of your work on this focused on the biomedical field, because that's where you work. One of our viewers is curious whether your findings were discipline specific, or if the prevalence of these fake or fraudulent papers is widespread across disciplines.
Yeah, I only have data for the biomedical field, and we use parameters, at least one parameter, which is hospital, which is by its nature, of course, not applicable to physics or chemistry. In some cases it may, but from observations and conversations by with other scientists, I know that other fields are affected as well to an extent that it is known. Especially computer science has a big problem with meeting reports. I've heard even fake activity in philosophy, in psychology, in market research, and other fields, but I have not quantitatively analyzed it. But it can be done if you use things like image duplication checks, things like that. But this is a task for another group to do that. So I assume that the problem is there as well. How big it is, I can't tell. But if we extrapolate from biomedicine, it may be also a main issue there.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So Elisabeth, as you were listening to Bernhard speak and share this with us, I'd be curious to hear sort of what was going through your mind and how you were thinking about applications of this to the work that you do sort of out in the field, but also with the policy community.
Yeah, so it's fascinating, right? And a couple of things spring to mind first. So one is I was in a computer lab at Columbia, was a work study student, and I saw one of the first algorithmically generated papers. And it was funny, right? Like it was really interesting. It didn't lie, right? It wasn't like the papers that Bernhard is talking about. It was a paper that was completely accurate, just nonsensical. Like it had error bars that went from the top and bottom of the screen, but it was formatted correctly. It had the flow and the look of a scientific paper. This was in the late 90s, right? And it was generated from a computer, and you could use that same program to generate other papers, which is of course hugely interesting and dangerous in different ways. And then I think the other topic that comes right to mind is what the danger of this is. And we were all around when we heard about alternative facts, right? You have your facts, I have mine. Around the time where alternative facts came up in the news, I was investigating a matter involved a collapse. Nobody got hurt, luckily, but we ended up at a panel with OSHA, the Occupational Safety Hazard Administration. And the OSHA administrator, after we gave our presentation, said, okay, your engineers have your facts and our engineers have ours. And maybe it was linguistic, right? But it was one of those eats in your stomach, the way that Bernhard's presentation does, right? This idea that people have different facts. That's not appropriate, right? I think around the same time, there's a leadership essay I wrote on the Alexander von Humboldt website that Google's well, if anybody's interested. But there is truth, right? There are things that are reliable and predictable that we use to build on. I'd say first, I'm a little bit out of context because I'm an engineer and not a scientist. So we do some things that are similar. But like in the middle of COVID, we had that beautiful satellite that was launched, and everybody, I felt so hopeful, right? Because we could launch a satellite that looks even farther, a telescope that's looking farther into the world, that has better pictures than we've ever seen of outer space. And I had a colleague, it's actually the founder of the company, but we teach together at Columbia, and he said, it's interesting, when they launch a satellite in space, they said the scientists did it. And when the rocket blows up, it's the engineer. So there's something about science being aspirational and cool and like a little bit far out there, and engineering being like the practical application of it, where stuff does go wrong and where things being right has a different importance, right? People can be sued for being wrong. So if the same kind of fraud happened in engineering that it seems to be happening in scientific publications, if you put out a drawing set that is a copy of somebody else's, you might get away with it. If you put out a drawing set that's a copy of somebody else's, but the geometry is just a little bit bigger, then that would be a number of the collapses I've investigated, right? It's just you take something that existed before that looks reasonable, you put it together in a way that looks professional, but it isn't because you haven't done the rigor. It's fraud, right? And that becomes dangerous. So there's the specific application of putting something out that's fraudulent, that's scary. There's the picture of what everybody feels about science that's scary. And then there's the part that's exciting, which this ChatGPT, this paper that was funny, if you can generate something that explains what you know in a way that other people can understand it, like if you can take a scientific paper and make it readable by the public, that's pretty cool, right? Mm-hmm. And like engineers don't know how to do that. We don't talk in public as much as scientists do. Like I'm trying today, right? But we don't, which is why we only get talked about when rockets blow up. We don't get talked about when the cool stuff happens. And pitch another thing while I'm talking here. There's my company that has a foundation, the Thornton Tomasetti Foundation, and we give out a technical literacy fellowship to make journalists and engineers work together so that they can communicate things to the public better. Like it's a real issue to communicate what's important better. And if ChatGPT and paper mills and all these support, if the side effect is that you can get an idea out in public that's true faster, that's pretty cool. And if these tools like what Bernhard's talking about can see the categories of, well, this is the category of stuff that fits this idea, this is a category that looks kind of like nonsense, that'd be pretty good, cool too, right? Like if you can categorize this as a set of papers that's essentially spam, and then this is a set of papers that's like, it's not necessarily well written, but they're kind of related to something. Maybe blockchain is a new topic. Like that'd be really interesting. So as much as there's parts of this that are, scary and dangerous, there's parts of it that are exciting too, I think.
So that's sort of
enjoy the conversation.
That's maybe a little controversial, right? To turn it around like that, but I think that you're right because it comes down to how does one make science accessible, and how does one make it understandable to a broader community, and that's something where some of these tools have the real potential to do that. But related to this, and related to your comment, Elisabeth, about sort of the distinction between the scientist and the engineer, and the human factor in all of this, one of our viewers is curious how we go about recognizing that a paper is fake to begin with if we're reviewing the manuscript as a reviewer. And so this is maybe more of a question for you, Bernhard, but the viewer says that in one manuscript that they were reviewing, they noticed that words were used in an odd way to describe a certain effect, right? So that comes back to what Elisabeth was saying about this computer-generated paper that was funny, right? It just didn't read the way that a human would write it.
Yeah, strange wordings are likely produced automatically. How to discover fake papers or red flag them, I can give some recommendations because now when, as a journal editor, I get a paper on my desk from my secretary who marks a few features, I throw it out in 5 seconds. So I really have a sort of an impression. I give you some examples. There are certain countries where the chance is higher that it's fake. So there you have already one criterion. Private emails is probably the strongest single criterion. Checking duplicate images is technically possible, but it costs money. You have to send it somewhere, somebody do it unless you know how to do it yourself. But if the reference list has a completely different font and a different style than the manuscript itself, or if the manuscript doesn't really fit your journal, or if you find that it's a really simple experiment, like I observe a gene change in some cell culture, and then you have 20 authors on it, you ask yourself, what are 20 authors doing in that one little experiment? Or you have variances. These are just examples. You look at variances, and they're all the same. Once I measured it with a ruler, and there was like an effect of a treatment over time, and the variances were all exactly identical. That is not plausible. Another example is tables and figures where all the numbers end at 0. or where the differences are so big and the variance is so small that in this kind of test, you would never expect that. These are all signs. And then as an editor, you have to make a decision, do I send it out for review, yes or no? And there is a legal question. The editor is not legally responsible for proving that the paper is wrong. The author has the burden of proof that the paper can be trusted. And if I have a reasonable doubt that the paper is trustable, I can throw it out without committing an ethical issue there. Yeah. I don't know if that answered the question, but there are multiple signs that you can use, and any number of them, several of them or some single ones can be quite effective.
I can provide a different color to that too. So after responding to collapses or emergencies, often there's a dispute, right? A legal dispute, which is the non-academic way of determining an outcome, right? Truth should be part of it, but outcome is the goal. I'll have a book out shortly about electronically sourced information and what that means for construction claims in specific. The ABA will put it out. I don't know the title, but it's a huge issue to be able to authenticate information. And so right now, you have a witness or the person that took the photograph, and they say, no, this is the photograph I took unaltered, right? But as more and more data is generated from different sources, and there are fake papers in the world and more sources of information that are unreliable, authentication becomes a big issue. And authenticating that, so most collapses in the last decade have had video of them. So it'll be interesting when the video of the collapse is fraudulent, right? So that hasn't happened yet in my experience. And the reason I don't think it's happened yet is because the failures match the video, right? There's a way to double check and cross back, which one always needs to do. But it's a whole huge new field. And it's a new field for academia as well, right? There's new software that comes out. It kind of balances this arms race of things that can be produced quickly and things that can be verified. So like Turnitin.com is a startup that's trying to check academic papers to see if they're copies, right? Not even if they're completely fake, but if they're somebody's just copying from somebody else. So I think this balance is interesting as far as new stuff gets generated, checking it and seeing whether or not it's reasonable for your publication, seeing if it's reasonable for court. More tools have to be developed, like yours, right? More tools have to be developed to help all of us.
So picking up on this notion of authenticating the information, I mean, one of the things that struck me when I first heard Bernhard on the radio and then read some of the articles about this is so much of science, it seems to me, and the publication of scientific papers is that the results should be able to be replicated elsewhere, right? I mean, that's part of it. These are peer-reviewed publications often, not always, but often, and the science should be replicated. I'm curious to know sort of how much of an impact that has as a example or as a criteria for the kind of analysis that you've been doing, Bernhard. But one of our viewers is also curious about the number of scientific papers that are out there that are in peer-reviewed publications that can't be replicated, and yet they influence policy discussions, just because they've appeared in these scientific publications. So that makes them quite dangerous, even though they can't be replicated.
Yeah, if you can't replicate a study, it doesn't mean that both authors were wrong or one of them was wrong. Right. Because at least in the field of biomedicine, there are so many factors that influence a finding that it's almost impossible to exactly replicate a study. Different people work on it. You may use a slightly different reagents, maybe slightly different temperature settings, and so on. So there are multiple factors why non-replication is expected to some extent. But I think that the fake publication contributes to this issue of non-reproducibility. And in the pharma industry, there is a study, or there were several studies that estimated that very small number of clinical trials or publications could be replicated, and most of them couldn't. And fake publication is a factor in it. But anyone that does lab research, working with this student, this rat, or this mouse, and so on, there are always differences between experiments. So in the ideal world, yes, you should be able to replicate everything. But in the real world, you have real people who have real changes, make different approaches, use different agents, materials, and what have you, that the true one-to-one replication is really rare. So I think as a scientist, you kind of look at the field in general. So when I look, my main field is vision restoration. So when you have a vision loss, what can you do to help the people? Then you see, well, who is working on it? What is their track record? And have they found something similar? Does it fit to the overall hypothesis? And then you get sort of a general consensus in your own mind. Yeah, that must be true. And that too is more like a sort of a gut feeling type of a decision you make. It's not like, oh, somebody replicated that study and therefore it's true, or they didn't and therefore it's wrong. So that issue is pretty complicated, the non-replication issue.
So since you also mentioned students, and since you work with students, I'd be incredibly interested in hearing about the implications for this in education, right? I mean, so as we talked about before we went live, we often talk about literacy, right? When it comes to students in education, and making sure that people have access to the right information, and that they think about the information that the sources that they're getting, and have the context for that. In this sense, when you're dealing with the sciences and when you're dealing with published papers, how does one go about educating students to question the veracity of that data and of that information?
Well, concerning the students, I can share a recent story. I just heard it the other day from a Chinese source, that on the social media, there was the case where a student said, my professor told me to write the review of my own paper that we're going to publish. And I got really confused by that, because what does it mean if I have to write the review for my own paper? What is going on? And so many students responded to it, and all anonymous. Yeah, they don't reveal their names. They said, we have noticed this, and we have found that there is fake, and there is publishing it, but we can't say anything. They lose trust in going into science at all, because they're getting confused if in the first year of their bachelor or master degree they find out this stuff is going on. Concerning how can we educate students, I think we should start educating ourselves first and finding ways to teach them, and then to say, this is what we can teach you. But if we teach the students, we help the paper mills get smarter. So there is kind of a catch-22 here, and in a way, it's an arms race. Question is, who is smarter in the end? But I sometimes say, I don't know if the word facetious is the right one, but I say, if this goes on with ChatGPT and all this fake, in the end, to relay a message from A to B, you probably write it better on paper and send the person to send it over to your contact. And then you can be sure it actually is coming from the right source. So we need to understand it, and then we need to teach ourselves, and we need to teach our students to watch out for it. But we need to develop kind of a science of detection. And we're only at the beginning of this journey. And I hope, and I still hope, and didn't give up the hope, that academic publishers will help in this effort.
So in that regard, I mean, looking to the future, and given that we only have a few minutes left, one key question that's been posed by a number of people, and that I have, is what's being done to crack down on fake publications, on these fraudulent papers. Should there be stricter guidelines in place? Is there a way to censor or somehow create a technology that can flag some of these potentially fake papers?
Yeah, there are beginning activities in this direction to flag papers or to identify fakes, because if you make a decision, you have to rely on useful information. The publishers announce that they are developing such tools. They are not sharing information how many fakes they found. I asked them several times at meetings. I hope they do it with the goal to maximize fishing them out of the crop the fakes. And there are a number of individual scientists, some of which have worked for years on identifying fakes and retracting papers from the scientific record. So there are a lot of individual activities, but I think what is really needed is a governmental activity, ideally globally, to find a security system for manuscripts that go into the scientific record, which is independent of the publishers, but for, of course, collaborating with them, but that is independent, because publishers do generate revenue from it. So I think just to be on the safe side and to protect everyone, the publishers and the public, is to have an independent system and a security measure that prevents them from entry. To give you one example, in 1974, the Olympic team, Israeli team, was killed by a terrorist attack from Palestinians in Munich. Before that time, you could walk into any airplane by just opening and closing the door. After that, a security system was installed to prevent this from happening again. I think we need some measures that are similar in scope, that identify reliable sources of information and reliable materials, similar to that. And that reduces the problem. It cannot eliminate it completely, but it certainly can reduce it significantly.
Elisabeth, any thoughts on that, on this sort of security system and how it might play out in a broader context?
A few things come to mind, and I think one was a question too. There aren't just fake papers. There's also papers that are wrong, right? So
Yeah,
there are a lot of gatekeeping. There's a lot of gatekeeping already, right? And I trust that the process of science, the things that we're talking about now, has a capacity to do better, right? Do better in the arms race that is clearly going on between these fake publications and what we're doing. But to say that, or to rely on something's provenance to make it true, is exactly what I think we're teaching students not to do, right? In my experience so whenever often if something collapses in the US, I get to investigate it eventually. My first one was the Minneapolis bridge collapse. The National Transportation Safety Board did an investigation, and they determined that the connection plates that hold the bridge together were too small. That was an accurate conclusion. It was, however, not relevant to the collapse. There's a series of publications that came up after that conclusion where people took the authority of the National Transportation Safety Board, and students wrote papers about these connection points. They're called gusset plates. And these connection points, and how, well, if it failed, then there must have been something about how we understand this connection that must be insufficient. And so it's worth more investigation. So something that wasn't accurate led to a whole lot of work that distracted from other work, right? So I put out a response in one of the publications that said, well, if you don't start with that assumption that the gusset plate failed, so on and so forth. But my point is figuring out what is relevant, useful, what is a predictive fact, right? We're talking about science. We're not talking about like the softer stuff. We're talking about the reliable stuff. So if your floor isn't strong enough for the loads on it, the floor will crack. And if there's a significant amount of load on it, the floor will collapse. So in the medical setting, right, like you have lots of things that make you feel better. Like I really like tea for making me feel better. Is it good for me, bad for me? What's the science on it? I don't rightly know, right? But it makes me feel better.
I think
if I take arsenic, I die, right? So there is truth and there is stuff that's soft. And figuring out what is the combination of information about a subject, right? So ideally, with these new tools at hand, you would see the National Transportation Safety Board's finding on my bridge collapse, along with all the other findings about that bridge collapse, so that people could see what rings true and what's relevant. They'd know the gusset plate's too small and that that's important, but see that the roller bearings didn't work and the temperature built up and the bridge buckled, and that that's important too, right? So there's something about these tools that might be really good at collecting information. So I wouldn't like ban them outright, right? It's back to ChatGPT might put a great paper together for somebody who has a good thought but can't write. But how do we do that without the fraud, right? No fraud.
Maybe I can just add a short comment to that. In the end, it's all about decision making. And in physics, it's easier to come to a decision than in psychology, medicine, biology, and so on. So the fundamental challenge that has always been there is how to derive at the right decisions. And that is usually a probability judgment.
Well, so that's maybe a nice way to ask a closing question, or a nice place to ask a closing question that one of our viewers posed, which is, do you have any suggestions on how to counter some of these dangerous trends so that society can develop or redevelop an appreciation of real science and true facts? Certainly during the course of our conversation, there's been some discussion on the sidelines about people having their own sets of facts, and each of you have talked about that. Elizabeth, you talked about that in your opening comments. And so I think the question here is, how do we make sure that we don't lose confidence in science? How do we make sure that people appreciate science moving forward, and that we get back to where we can share facts, even if we differ in how those facts are interpreted?
My first response would be, if you cite numbers from scientific studies on the public level, you need to be competent to make the proper interpretation of what these numbers really mean and to interpret them correctly. How can we help the system to move forward? I think one is to know more about how to detect fake, then to attach some information to published work, and to new manuscripts. What is the probability of fake? And then also to think about a governmental control or independent control, shall I say, that attaches conclusions about certain works being published, and finally to sanction authors or institutions who are not supportive of such security methodologies.
Elizabeth, do you have any thoughts?
But just on that, so that sounds like a standard of care for publications which aren't put out by professionals, and you need a standard for, it's really tricky to sanction, right? And to have a government decide. I think that I'm really, really hopeful. Like what we can do now, what my phone does now, what we have together accomplished is more than what we did yesterday. And we have big problems to solve on climate change, on making the dumb thing not break, right? Like there's always some hinge that's not strong enough in the middle of whatever toy or computer or product or whatever we've got. There's real things that still need work, right? Medical field needs a lot of work. Women exist, right? Like there's things that we are still catching up to that all of this will help with, right? Like this questioning Bernhard's article, what we're talking about, this is part of the process to get to the right thing. And so we could talk about government regulation. I could argue against it, but that doesn't matter, right? It's this process of being able to question, which is at the heart of science. Not that it's right? Like my biggest problem in emergency responses is asbestos. The people who invented asbestos were brilliant because it does not burn, right? So it was a great product that ended up being terrible and has lasting impacts. Mm-hmm. And so that wasn't fake, that wasn't wrong, but it's terrible. And so we keep working to take those new technologies, ChatGPT, all that stuff, and use it for good, not for the bad thing.
Elisabeth,
I'm very excited.
Just to qualify by governmental, I didn't mean that the government should do it. It should be an independent body that is run by scientists.
And so codes for engineering are developed by independent bodies, and many of them are very good, right? I find most of what we put together to be very reliable for construction, but also stodgy. So it ends up being slower, and science needs to go fast. So it'll be interesting.
I mean, I think this is one of the core questions, right? Given the gravity of this challenge and the reach of this challenge, what sorts of institutions, as one of our viewers right? What sorts of institutions would have the, quote, intellectual and moral authority to alert citizens, governments, communities to the danger, right? Is this something that we turn to the United Nations for? Is it something that we turn to the World Health Organization for? Are there economic organizations or entities? But then also, what sort of legislative measures can be taken at home? I'm reminded, in this conversation of something that we talk about frequently at the ACG, that government legislation lags behind scientific development so much, and so it's very difficult to introduce rules, regulations, guidelines in real time with some of these scientific developments to try to frame them. So I think we're sort of unpacking a huge challenge here. Bernhard, let me have you have a last word and then a final word to Elisabeth.
Well, I'm glad I can have the last word. That doesn't happen too often when I talk to my wife, but just a joke aside. I mean, the issue is complex, so I don't think that there is one institution that can do it, but it has to be a consortium. In Europe, I would think of the ERC, the European Research Council. It could be national academies of sciences that truly are supportive of finding the truth rather than making money or making politics. Or any other organization that is funded independent of revenue that they generate from selling something. So that's funded governmentally, but not controlled governmentally, I guess I'm saying.
Mm-hmm.
And they are probably the best place to start. But of course, get all partners on board, funding organizations, publishers, scientific societies, and maybe governmental bodies as well, ministries, what have you. And certainly the legislation needs to think of ways to solve it, because it is a major risk on all levels of society and the biggest science scam of all times.
Thank you. Elisabeth, any final thoughts for us today?
I'll stand being hopeful. So I have more trust in Bernhard than seems to have himself. So this kind of looking at what the patterns are of reliable and unreliable papers or production, or this open information and how it was meant to be a good thing, right? The open access journals, and open sharing of data and where things come from. We have the opportunity to crack it, right? Like to get a really good spam filter between us by whatever method, and hopefully it'll help talk about those things that are worth communicating with the public, where we can do a better job and talk more, publish more, right? Not have that be a bad thing, but just with rich.
I think it comes down to really having to have more conversations like this, right? To increase awareness about this as an issue more broadly, but then also to talk about constructive solutions and a path forward. And so on behalf of the American Friends of the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation and the American Council on Germany, I just really want to thank both of you for taking the time to talk with us today. I think this has been a fascinating discussion on many levels. I feel like we're just scratching the surface and that there's a lot more to unpack here. And so maybe in the months ahead, we'll be able to continue the conversation. But a herzlichen Dank to both of you for joining us today. Many thanks to our viewers for tuning in and for some great questions in the process. And of course, thanks to Christian and the American Friends of the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation for partnering with us today.
Well, thank you all. Thanks.
Thank you.